Dr. Sarah Chen felt her stomach drop as the transport shuttle approached the massive alien ship. She had seen pictures, but nothing prepared her for the real thing. The vessel called Harmonious Convergence stretched for miles through space, its surface gleaming like a soap bubble in the starlight. It looked more like a work of art than a spaceship. Sarah pressed her face to the small window and watched the docking bay open. The entrance was huge, easily large enough to fit 10 Earth shuttles side by side. But what struck her most was how delicate everything looked. The docking arms that reached out to guide their shuttle were thin as spider silk, yet they moved with perfect precision. "First time seeing alien tech up close?" asked Captain Martinez, the shuttle pilot. He was one of the few humans who had made this trip before, delivering supplies to the diplomatic team. "It's incredible," Sarah whispered. "How does something so thin hold a shuttle?" Martinez chuckled. "Wait until you see the inside. Everything here is built for low gravity. These aliens never had to deal with things falling down and breaking." The shuttle settled into the docking bay with barely a bump. Sarah gathered her belongings, a simple briefcase with her notes and a few personal items. She had been chosen to represent Earth in these first formal talks with the Galactic Council. As a structural engineer and physicist, her job was to learn about alien technology and see how humans might fit into their advanced civilization. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and Sarah stepped into a world that defied everything she knew about building and design. The corridor walls were made of some transparent material that seemed to bend light around it. They curved in impossible ways, supported by nothing she could see. Thin beams of colored light held up platforms that floated in midair. "Welcome to the Harmonious Convergence," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Please follow the guide lights to the main reception hall." Sarah walked carefully along the glowing path on the floor. Everything around her seemed to float or drift gently. She saw alien crew members moving through the air like swimmers, pushing off walls with their fingertips to glide from place to place. Some wore flowing robes that billowed around them like underwater plants. Others had no legs at all, just long arms that they used to pull themselves along guide ropes. The reception hall took Sarah's breath away. It was a massive sphere, at least 100 feet across with no clear floor or ceiling. Aliens floated at different levels throughout the space, some upside down from Sarah's perspective, others sideways. At the center hung a platform where the most important aliens waited. "Ah, the human representative arrives," said a tall, thin being that floated down to Sarah's level. It had pale blue skin and arms that seemed too long for its body. When it moved, it looked like it was swimming through thick honey. "I am Ambassador HFY of the Zephyrian Collective. We have been most curious to meet your species." Sarah tried to bow politely, but the movement felt clumsy and heavy compared to the graceful motions of the aliens around her. "Thank you for having me, Ambassador. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, representing Earth." HFY's large eyes studied her with what might have been amusement. "Please come meet the others." Sarah followed as the ambassador glided effortlessly toward the central platform. She had to walk on what seemed to be the only solid surface in the room, a narrow pathway that curved up and around the sphere. Every step felt loud and jarring in the peaceful silence of the floating aliens. On the platform, Sarah met representatives from 12 different species. There were the crystalline Vortaki, who looked like living gemstones and spoke in musical chimes. The gaseous Nimari appeared as clouds of colored mist that somehow held shape and moved with purpose. Each species was more fantastic than the last, and all of them studied Sarah with obvious curiosity. "Welcome to our first formal gathering," announced a Vortaki, whose crystal body rang like a bell when it spoke. "We have called this meeting to discuss how your species might join our galactic community." Sarah felt a chill at the word might. It suggested that joining was not guaranteed. HFY floated higher and began what was clearly a prepared speech. "The human species presents us with a unique challenge," he said, his voice carrying easily through the sphere. "Your homeworld is what we classify as a high-gravity death world. Your people have been trapped in a gravity well so severe that it has stunted your technological development." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled aliens. Sarah felt her cheeks burn but forced herself to stay quiet. "Consider the facts," HFY continued. "Humans still use crude materials like metal and stone in their construction. They build structures that must constantly fight against gravitational collapse. Their vehicles must burn enormous amounts of fuel just to escape their planet's surface. Most primitive of all, They have never learned to free themselves from the tyranny of falling objects. More murmurs, and Sarah caught what sounded like alien laughter. She looked around at the beautiful, impossible architecture surrounding her, platforms that hung in space without support, walls that curved without breaking, beings who moved like dancers through three-dimensional space. However, Kethvar said, raising one long arm for attention, we are a compassionate council. We believe that with proper guidance and extensive modification, humans can learn to transcend their crude physical limitations. We have technologies that can free you from your gravity addiction. We can teach you to build as we build, to move as we move, to think beyond the primitive concept of things that fall. The speech continued for another hour, with various aliens describing the wonderful future that awaited humanity. They spoke of anti-gravity suits that would let humans float freely, of new building materials that weighed nothing but were stronger than anything on Earth, of ships that could reshape themselves in flight because they didn't need to worry about structural stress. Through it all, Sarah noticed something that the aliens didn't seem to realize. Everything in their beautiful advanced civilization required constant power. The floating platforms hummed with energy fields. The walls were held up by force beams that glowed softly in the dim light. Even the aliens themselves wore devices that helped them control their movement through the air. When the speeches finally ended, Sarah was shown to her quarters. The room was a small sphere with no furniture as humans would understand it. Instead, soft surfaces could be shaped by touching control panels, forming chairs or beds or tables as needed. It was incredibly advanced, but Sarah found herself wondering what would happen if the power went out. She floated to the room's single window and looked out at the stars. Earth was somewhere out there, a small blue world where everything fell down and stayed down, where engineers had to build bridges strong enough to hold their own weight, plus traffic, plus wind, plus earthquakes, where every structure had to be designed with the constant, unforgiving pull of gravity in mind. For the first time since arriving, Sarah smiled. These aliens saw Earth's gravity as a primitive limitation. They looked at humanity's heavy, crude technology with pity. But as she watched a delicate alien maintenance drone drift past her window, moving slowly and carefully to avoid any sudden impacts, she began to wonder who was really limited. Tomorrow, the real negotiations would begin. The aliens would present their plans for improving humanity, for freeing them from their gravity prison. Sarah touched the window, feeling the slight vibration of the ship's systems working constantly to maintain their perfect, controlled environment. She thought about home, where things fell when you dropped them, where buildings had to be strong, where every human innovation had been forged in the crucible of relentless physical force. Maybe it was time these graceful, floating aliens learned what humans had always known, that the strongest structures are built by those who understand the power of the fall. Sarah's second day aboard the Harmonious Convergence began with what the aliens called a cultural orientation tour. She met her guide in the main corridor, a being called Veltar who belonged to a species that looked like walking plants. His skin was green and bark-like, and small leaves grew from his arms and shoulders. Dr. Chen, Veltar said in a voice that rustled like wind through branches, today we will show you the wonders of proper civilization. Perhaps seeing our achievements will help your species understand how much you have yet to learn. Sarah bit back her first response and simply nodded. I'm looking forward to it. Their first stop was the ship's main engineering section. Sarah expected to see something like the engine room she knew from Earth ships, hot, noisy spaces filled with massive machinery and thick metal pipes. Instead, she found herself in a vast, quiet chamber filled with floating geometric shapes that pulsed with soft light. Behold our gravitational control matrix, Veltar announced proudly. These field generators maintain perfect environmental conditions throughout our vessel. No crude mechanical systems, no heavy materials, no primitive concerns about structural support. The shapes, pyramids, spheres, and forms Sarah had no names for, drifted slowly through the air in complex patterns. Streams of energy flowed between them like rivers of light. It was beautiful, Sarah had to admit, but she noticed something else. Every surface showed stress indicators, constant readouts monitoring the delicate balance of forces. What happens if one of the generators fails? Sarah asked. Veltar's leaf-covered head tilted in what might have been confusion. Fails, why would it fail? Our technology is far beyond such primitive concerns. We have backup systems and backups for the backups. But what if they all failed? What would hold the ship together? The alien engineer made a sound like branches creaking in a storm, probably laughter. My dear human, that scenario is impossible. Your species thinks in such limited ways because you come from a world where things break under their own weight. Here we have transcended such crude limitations. Sarah watched one of the field generators drift past, its surface covered with warning lights and status displays. She had spent her career designing buildings that could stand for centuries with minimal maintenance. This beautiful alien technology seemed to require constant attention just to keep working. Their next stop was the ship's construction bay, where repair drones worked on damaged sections of the hull. The drones themselves were marvels. They moved like ballet dancers, spinning and turning as they welded seams with beams of controlled energy. But Sarah noticed they worked very slowly and carefully, taking great care to avoid any sudden movements. Your repair work is very precise, Sarah observed. Of course, said Veltar. Our hull materials are incredibly advanced, stronger than any crude metals your species uses, yet lighter than air. But they require delicate handling. A shock or impact could propagate fractures throughout the entire structure. Sarah nodded, thinking of the steel beams and concrete foundations back on Earth. Crude and heavy, yes, but designed to absorb impacts and distribute stress. She watched one of the repair drones accidentally bump into a wall panel. The collision was so gentle it would barely disturb a soap bubble, yet the drone immediately backed away and began scanning for damage. Tell me about your emergency procedures, Sarah said. What do you do if the ship is attacked or damaged? Veltar's leaves rustled with what sounded like discomfort. Such violent scenarios are rare in civilized space. Our conflicts are resolved through negotiation and economic pressure. We have defense screens that can deflect most weapons. But what if something got through? Then our repair systems would address the damage. Veltar gestured to the dancing drones. Though I must say, your questions reveal the violent mindset of a gravity world species. You think in terms of catastrophic failure because your harsh environment has trained you to expect things to break. As the tour continued, Sarah began to see a pattern. Every alien technology was incredibly advanced but also incredibly fragile. Their food production systems grew delicious meals from pure energy, but required perfect environmental controls. Their transportation networks could move beings instantly across the ship, but couldn't function if the power fluctuated. Their communication systems could translate between dozens of languages in real time, but needed constant recalibration. In the afternoon, they visited the ship's main library, a spherical chamber where information floated as glowing symbols in the air. Alien scholars drifted between the data streams, absorbing knowledge directly into their minds through neural interfaces. This is how civilized beings share information, explained the librarian, a gaseous Nimari who appeared as a cloud of purple mist. No crude physical books, no primitive writing implements, pure thought transfer. Sarah watched the floating symbols with fascination, but also noticed the complex machinery required to maintain the system. Generators hummed constantly, keeping the data stream stable. Backup processors monitored every transaction. The entire library was essentially a massive computer that never shut down. What did you do before this technology? Sarah asked. The Nimari's mist swirled in confusion. Before, there was no before. This is how information has always been stored and shared in civilized society. But someone must have invented this system. How did they record their early experiments and designs? The question seemed to baffle the librarian. After a long pause, it admitted, I do not know. Such primitive concerns are not relevant to modern civilization. Sarah smiled and pulled out her notebook, a simple spiral-bound pad of paper. She flipped through pages covered with her handwritten notes and sketches. The aliens around her stared in fascination. This is how humans record information, she said. It requires no power, works in any environment, and lasts for centuries. One of the alien scholars floated closer, studying the notebook like it was an ancient artifact. But how do you share this information with others? We read it to them, or make copies. Sarah demonstrated by writing a simple equation on a fresh page. This will still be readable even if every power system on this ship fails. The scholars exchanged glances that somehow conveyed amazement even across species barriers. The concept of information storage that didn't require technology seemed to astound them. Later that evening, Sarah attended a social gathering in one of the ship's recreation areas. Aliens from different species mingled in the air, Sharing stories and discussing philosophy, the conversation inevitably turned to humanity's future and galactic civilization. The humans will need extensive modification, declared a crystalline Vortaki, its body chiming like wind chimes as it spoke. Their gravity addiction has made them completely unsuited for civilized environments. Indeed, agreed Ambassador HFY, floating nearby. They cannot even move properly without crude mechanical assistance. And their technology. All that heavy metal and stone construction, it's like they're still living in caves. Sarah listened politely as the aliens discussed humanity's shortcomings. They spoke about humans the way she might discuss a newly discovered tribe that hadn't invented the wheel yet. Their tone was kindly condescending, like adults planning how to help a struggling child. The first step will be anti-gravity implants, suggested a plant-like alien similar to Veltar. Once humans learn to float freely, they can begin to understand proper construction techniques. We'll need to retrain their engineers completely, added another. Their entire approach to building is based on primitive concepts like load-bearing and structural integrity. Sarah almost laughed at that last comment. Structural integrity was primitive? She thought of the skyscrapers of Earth, standing tall through earthquakes and hurricanes. She thought of bridges that carried millions of tons of traffic every day for decades without failure. She thought of the deep mines and underwater habitats where humans worked in environments that would crush these delicate aliens instantly. What about their vehicles? Asked the Vortaki. Those crude rockets that barely reach orbit? Completely obsolete, HFY replied. Once they have proper anti-gravity technology, they won't need such violent methods of propulsion. Sarah touched her notebook in her pocket. Tomorrow, she would begin presenting Earth's proposals for joining the galactic community. But tonight, she was starting to wonder if these advanced aliens understood the difference between sophisticated and fragile. As the gathering wound down, Sarah made her way back to her quarters. In the corridor, she passed a maintenance team working on what appeared to be a minor malfunction. One of the wall panels was flickering between transparent and opaque. The repair required 4 specialists, each with different tools, working for over an hour to recalibrate the energy matrix. Sarah thought of the maintenance crews back on Earth, who could fix most problems with a handful of basic tools and some creative thinking. She thought of systems designed to be repaired in the field by ordinary people without specialized equipment. The aliens saw human technology as primitive because it was heavy and crude. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that primitive might just be another word for reliable. Tomorrow would bring new revelations. But tonight she was already forming a new appreciation for the strength that came from living in a world where everything fell down unless you built it strong enough. Sarah woke on her 3rd day to the gentle chiming that served as the ship's morning alarm. Today was the big day, the formal diplomatic session where the Galactic Council would present their improvement plan for humanity. She dressed carefully in her simple Earth clothes, which looked plain and heavy compared to the flowing, weightless garments the aliens wore. The central council chamber was even more impressive than the reception hall. It was a perfect sphere nearly 200 feet across with delegates floating at different levels throughout the space. At the very center hung an ornate platform where the council leaders waited. Sarah was assigned a small area near the bottom of the chamber, the only section with a solid floor, built specifically for the gravity-dependent human. "Welcome to this historic session," announced the council's leader, a being that looked like living starlight. "Today we finalize the integration protocols for species designation Earth-Human." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out her notebook and pen. The simple action drew curious stares from nearby aliens. In a chamber filled with floating holographic displays and thought interface devices, her paper and pen looked absurdly primitive. Ambassador HFY began the presentation, his tall form gliding gracefully through the air. "Our analysis of human civilization reveals a species trapped by their hostile environment. The gravitational field of their homeworld has prevented proper technological development and stunted their social evolution." Charts appeared in the air, showing comparative data between human and alien societies. The numbers made humanity look hopelessly backward. Their ships were slower, their buildings heavier, their energy systems less efficient. However, HFY continued, "We have developed a comprehensive rehabilitation program. Stage 1 involves relocating human populations to low-gravity habitats, where they can begin to unlearn their primitive movement patterns. Sarah wrote notes as the presentation continued. The aliens planned to essentially rebuild human civilization from scratch. They would replace Earth's heavy industry with anti-gravity manufacturing. They would teach humans to build with energy fields instead of physical materials. They would provide technology to free humanity from what they called gravitational imprisonment, to addresses the human psychological dependence on falling objects, explained a Vortaki specialist whose crystal body tinkled as it spoke. Humans have developed primitive concepts like up and down that limit their thinking. Through careful retraining, we can expand their spatial awareness to full three-dimensional freedom. More charts appeared, showing brain scans and behavioral studies. The aliens had clearly put enormous effort into understanding humanity's disability. They spoke about gravity the way doctors might discuss a crippling disease. Stage 3 involves complete technological replacement, announced Chief Engineer Veltar. Human construction methods are not merely inefficient, they are dangerous. Buildings that depend on crude materials like steel and concrete are accidents waiting to happen. We will teach humans to build with proper energy matrix techniques. Sarah looked around the chamber at the beautiful, impossible architecture. Everything here defied Earth's understanding of physics. Platforms hung unsupported in the air, walls curved without buttresses or foundations. The entire ship was essentially a massive bubble of controlled spacetime, held together by constant energy input. The timeline for complete human rehabilitation is estimated at 300 years. HFY concluded. After that period, your species should be capable of basic participation in galactic civilization. 300 years. Sarah wrote the number in her notebook, pressing hard enough that her pen left an impression on the page below. Around her, alien delegates floated in satisfied silence, pleased with their generous offer to uplift the primitive humans. Dr. Chen called the starlight being at the chamber's center. As Earth's representative, please share your species' response to our proposal. Sarah stood up, feeling heavy and awkward in the graceful chamber. Every movement she made seemed clumsy compared to the fluid motions of the floating aliens. She cleared her throat and began to speak. Honored council members, she said, I want to thank you for the enormous effort you've put into understanding humanity. Your proposal is comprehensive. She paused, choosing her words carefully. However, I think there may be some misunderstandings about human capabilities. Rather than accepting your rehabilitation program immediately, I'd like to propose a trial period where humans work alongside galactic citizens as equals. A ripple of surprised sounds echoed through the chamber. Several aliens began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in different languages. Equals? HFY's elongated form seemed to stiffen. Dr. Chen, I fear you don't understand the situation. Humans are barely capable of space travel. Your technology is centuries behind ours. Equality is simply not possible until your species has been properly elevated. With respect, Ambassador, Sarah replied, I think you might be surprised by what humans can contribute right now. She was reaching for her pen to jot down some quick notes when the chamber suddenly lurched. Not violently, just a gentle shift that made the floating platforms wobble slightly. But in a civilization that had never experienced unexpected movement, even a small disturbance was alarming. Warning lights began flashing throughout the chamber. Alien voices rose in concern as delegates struggled to maintain their positions. The floating platforms that had hung so gracefully in the air now drifted unpredictably. Gravitational fluctuation in Sector 7, announced a mechanical voice from the ship's computer. Compensating. Unable to fully stabilize, minor field variations expected throughout the vessel. Sarah felt the change immediately. For just a moment, the chamber experienced something approaching real gravity, maybe a tenth of Earth normal, but enough to give weight to objects that had been weightless for eons. The aliens around her were clearly distressed by this tiny taste of gravitational force. They clutched at guide ropes and support beams, their graceful movements becoming awkward and panicked. Their anti-gravity suits whined with strain as they fought to maintain position, but Sarah barely noticed the fluctuation. A tenth of Earth gravity felt like nothing to someone who had lived her entire life under the full force of her homeworld's pull. She remained standing calmly while aliens flailed around her in barely contained panic. Without thinking, she shifted her weight and accidentally let go of her pen. On Earth, dropping a pen was meaningless, something that happened dozens of times a day. The pen would fall, hit the floor with a soft click, and someone would pick it up, No big deal. But this pen had been manufactured on Earth in full gravity. It had real mass, real density. And now, for the first time in its existence, it was falling in a chamber designed for objects that had no weight. The pen dropped toward the chamber floor with all the inevitability of a meteor. In the microgravity environment of the ship, nothing ever fell hard. Objects drifted gently downward if they moved at all. The chamber's beautiful crystalline floor had been designed for the soft settling of weightless debris, not the impact of an object that had actually fallen. The pen hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the sphere like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then spiderweb cracks began racing outward from the impact point. The crystalline material, beautiful and strong in its intended environment, had never been designed to handle the focused impact of a falling object. The cracks spread rapidly, following stress lines that had never been calculated, because the engineers who built this place had never imagined that anything would ever actually hit the floor with force. Emergency protocols activated. The ship's computer announced with what sounded like surprise. Structural failure detected in main council chamber. All personnel evacuate immediately, but the aliens couldn't evacuate quickly. Their graceful floating civilization had never needed to develop rapid emergency procedures. They moved like dancers, not like people fleeing danger. Their evacuation was a slow, careful process of guiding floating platforms toward exits while maintaining proper formation. Sarah watched the cracks spread across the floor, calculating stress vectors and failure points with the instinct of someone who had spent her career designing things that couldn't be allowed to break. The damage was extending beyond the initial impact zone, threatening the structural supports that held the floating platforms in place. The main support pylons, she called out to the nearest alien engineer. You need to redistribute the load before the whole chamber collapses. The engineer, an insect-like being with compound eyes, stared at her in confusion. Redistribute? I don't understand. The energy matrix should automatically compensate for any structural variations. But the energy matrix had been designed for a perfect environment, not for the chaotic stress patterns created by actual falling objects. Sarah could see the failure cascading through the chamber's support systems as delicate force fields struggled to adapt to entirely new types of strain. Around her, the most advanced civilization in the galaxy was helpless in the face of a dropped Ubir. The council chamber erupted into chaos as the cracks spread faster across the crystalline floor. What had started as spiderweb fractures around Sarah's fallen pen now stretched across half the chamber. The floating platforms that had hung so gracefully in the air began to sway and drift as their anchor points weakened. The support matrix is failing, called out Chief Engineer Veltar, his plant-like form shaking with leaves falling like panic. I don't understand how this is happening. The calculations show the energy fields should be compensating automatically. Sarah watched the evacuation with growing alarm. The aliens moved with their usual grace, but grace wasn't what this situation needed. They formed orderly lines at the exits, maintaining proper spacing and protocol even as their chamber crumbled around them. Some of the floating delegates were actually waiting their turn to evacuate, following social customs that had no place in an emergency. You need to move faster, Sarah called out to a group of crystalline Vortaki who were drifting slowly toward an exit. The ceiling anchors are starting to fail, the lead Vortaki chimed in confusion. Move faster? But proper evacuation procedure requires calm, orderly withdrawal. Haste leads to accidents. Accidents? Sarah stared at the alien in disbelief. Look around you. This whole chamber is about to collapse. But even as she said it, Sarah realized the problem. These beings had never experienced a real emergency. Their technology was so advanced, their environment so controlled, that catastrophic failure was simply outside their experience. They had evacuation procedures, but they were designed for minor problems that could be solved with patience and proper technique. Another section of floor gave way with a sound like breaking glass. One of the floating platforms tilted dangerously as its anchor points shifted. The aliens on the platform maintained their composure, adjusting their positions with fluid grace, apparently unaware that they were seconds away from falling. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified any safety inspector back on Earth. She ran toward the failing platform, her heavy footsteps echoing strangely in the normally silent chamber. Her Earth-trained muscles, dense and strong from a lifetime of fighting gravity, carried her across the unstable floor with surprising speed. What are you doing? gasped Ambassador HFY as Sarah approached his platform. "The floor is unstable. You could cause more damage." "I'm preventing a catastrophe," Sarah replied, reaching the platform's base. She quickly examined the support structure, a delicate network of energy beams and crystalline anchors that was never designed for this kind of stress. The problem was obvious to someone trained in structural engineering. The platform's weight was distributed through 6 anchor points, but the floor damage had weakened 4 of them. The remaining 2 anchors were taking all the load and they were starting to fail. "I need something heavy," Sarah said, looking around the chamber. "Something with real mass that I can use as a counterweight." The aliens stared at her with blank incomprehension. Heavy mass? These concepts barely existed in their weightless civilization. "Your cargo containers," Sarah said, pointing to some storage units near one of the exits. "The ones with physical materials inside." "Those are supply pods," said Veltar. "They contain mineral samples from primitive worlds." "Why would you want them?" "Because they have mass," Sarah explained, already moving toward the containers. "Real weight that doesn't depend on energy fields." She reached the nearest container, a box about the size of a small refrigerator that probably held rock samples or metal ores. On Earth, it would have taken 2 people to lift it. Here, in the ship's reduced gravity, Sarah could barely manage it alone, but she could move it. The aliens watched in amazement as Sarah dragged the container across the chamber. Their repair drones could have moved it easily with anti-gravity fields, but the drones had been evacuated with everything else. They had no experience with manual labor, no concept of moving objects through pure physical effort. "Dr. Chen," called HFY from his swaying platform. "What are you attempting to accomplish?" "Basic physics," Sarah grunted, positioning the container near the platform's base. "If I can create a counter moment to balance the failing supports, the platform should stabilize." She began stacking more containers, building a rough pyramid that would redistribute the platform's weight. It was crude engineering, the kind of emergency repair that humans did every day but aliens had never needed to consider. "This is madness," declared one of the Vortaki as Sarah's makeshift counterweight began to take effect. "You're using primitive materials to support advanced technology. The energy matrix isn't designed for such crude interventions." "The energy matrix is failing," Sarah pointed out, adjusting the position of another container. "Sometimes crude interventions are exactly what you need." As her improvised support system took shape, the platform stopped swaying. The dangerous tilt corrected itself as the weight distribution changed. It wasn't elegant and it certainly wasn't beautiful, but it worked. "Impossible," breathed Veltar. "You've stabilized the platform using nothing but primitive materials and physical force." "Welcome to human engineering," Sarah said, checking her work. "We call it making do with what you have." But the chamber wasn't finished collapsing. Even as she solved the platform problem, Sarah could see other structural failures developing. The beautiful ceiling was starting to sag as its support network failed. More floor sections were developing cracks. The entire chamber was experiencing a cascade failure as each broken component put additional stress on the remaining systems. "We need to evacuate everyone now," Sarah announced. "This whole section is going to come down." "The evacuation is proceeding according to proper protocols," insisted a gaseous Nimari administrator. "All personnel will be safely removed within 47 minutes. "We don't have 47 minutes, Sarah said, pointing to a ceiling section that was visibly drooping. "That's going to fall in less than 10. She looked around at the remaining aliens, maybe 30 beings still floating calmly in various parts of the chamber, waiting their turn to leave through the designated exits. They were following procedures designed for orderly withdrawal from minor problems, not rapid escape from structural collapse. Sarah cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted with the full power of lungs, trained to work in Earth's thick atmosphere. "Everyone out now. Emergency evacuation, move." The volume and urgency of her voice cut through the aliens' calm like a knife. For the first time since the crisis began, they seemed to understand that this was not a minor technical problem to be solved with patience and proper technique. But understanding the urgency and knowing how to act on it were different things. The aliens began moving faster, but their version of fast was still frustratingly slow by human standards. They had never needed to learn rapid emergency response. Sarah took charge with the kind of decisive authority that came from growing up in a world where hesitation could kill you. She began directing traffic, pointing aliens toward the nearest exits and organizing them into groups that could move together efficiently. "You three," she called to a cluster of plant-like beings, "help that injured Vortaki reach the exit. You," she pointed to a floating administrator, "get everyone out of the upper section before those ceiling anchors fail." The aliens responded to her commands with surprising obedience. In their crisis, they instinctively turned to the one being who seemed to know what to do, the primitive gravity worlder who had grown up solving problems with brute force and quick thinking. As the last of the aliens escaped through the exits, Sarah heard a deep groaning sound from above. The ceiling was finally giving way, its delicate support matrix overwhelmed by stresses it was never designed to handle. She ran for the nearest exit as sections of the beautiful crystalline ceiling began to fall behind her. In the ship's low gravity, even the falling debris moved slowly, giving her time to dodge the larger pieces. But she could hear the entire chamber collapsing as the cascade failure reached its inevitable conclusion. Sarah made it through the exit just as the main ceiling supports gave way. Behind her, the most magnificent council chamber in galactic civilization collapsed into a pile of broken crystal and twisted energy conduits. In the corridor outside, dozens of aliens floated in shocked silence, staring at the closed emergency doors that sealed off the ruined chamber. Many of them were injured, not seriously, but enough to require medical attention. Their delicate bodies weren't designed for emergency evacuation. "Status report," demanded Admiral Theknor, the ship's commanding officer, as he arrived with emergency crews. "What happened in there?" "Cascade structural failure initiated by kinetic impact," reported Veltar, his voice shaking. The entire chamber matrix collapsed within minutes. Kinetic impact? The Admiral's compound eyes focused on Sarah. What kind of weapon caused this damage? Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her pen, the simple writing instrument that had started the whole disaster. "This," she said quietly. The assembled aliens stared at the pen in stunned silence. The idea that their most important chamber had been destroyed by a dropped writing tool was almost incomprehensible. "But how?" whispered Kethvar. "It's just a small object. Our floors are designed to handle any reasonable impact." "That's the problem," Sarah explained. "Your floors are designed for objects." 3 days later, Sarah found herself in a very different kind of meeting. Instead of the Grand Council chamber with its floating delegates and impossible architecture, the emergency session convened in one of the ship's cargo bays, the only space large enough and, more importantly, structurally sound enough to hold everyone safely. The cargo bay looked nothing like the rest of the ship. Here function mattered more than beauty. The walls were plain metal, reinforced with actual support beams. The floor was solid, designed to bear the weight of heavy containers. It was the closest thing to Earth-normal construction anywhere on the harmonious convergence. "This is where we should have met from the beginning," Sarah thought as she watched the aliens adapt awkwardly to the space. Without their floating platforms and energy fields, they seemed diminished somehow, still graceful but no longer effortlessly superior. Admiral Theknor called the session to order. The ship's commander had spent the past 3 days reviewing damage reports and learning uncomfortable truths about his vessel's construction. "The purpose of this gathering," he announced, "is to reassess our previous conclusions about human integration into galactic society." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. The tone was very different from their first meeting, where before they had spoken with condescending kindness about humanity's limitations. Now there was uncertainty in their voices. Ambassador Kethvar stood to address the group, but this time he remained on the floor instead of floating above everyone else. "Dr. Chen," he said, his elongated form somehow less imposing when gravity-bound, "I believe we owe your species an apology." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For our assumption that technological advancement necessarily meant the abandonment of physical principles." Kethvar gestured to the plain walls around them. "The past 3 days have been educational." Chief Engineer Veltar rustled forward, his leaf-covered arms carrying a data pad. "Dr. Chen, I've spent every waking hour since the incident analyzing our ship's construction. I need to ask you some questions. Go ahead. When you stabilized the falling platform, you used what you called counterweight distribution. This concept doesn't exist in our engineering databases." "How did you know it would work?" Sarah smiled. "Because I've seen it work 1,000 times. Every skyscraper on Earth uses counterweights. Every bridge balances forces. Every structure has to account for its own weight, plus whatever loads it carries. But how do you calculate such forces without computer modeling? Practice, Sarah said simply. When you grow up in a world where things fall down and stay down, you develop an intuition for structural mechanics. You can look at something and see where the stress points are, where it's likely to fail. Veltar's leaves rustled in what might have been amazement. You're saying humans can perform structural analysis instinctively? Not instinctively, but we learn it early and we learn it well, because buildings that fall down kill people. A new voice joined the conversation, Dr. Zarathek, the ship's chief scientist. Dr. Chen, I've been reviewing your species' construction techniques. Your primitive buildings routinely last for centuries with minimal maintenance. Our most advanced structures require constant energy input and regular recalibration. How is this possible? Sarah thought about how to explain it in terms the aliens would understand. You've optimized for efficiency and elegance. We've optimized for reliability and durability. Your technology is more advanced, but ours is more robust. Robust, repeated Dr. Zarathek as if tasting the word. You mean resistant to failure? Exactly. On Earth, we assume things will break. So we design systems that can keep working even when components fail. We build in redundancy, not just backup systems, but completely different ways of accomplishing the same task. Admiral Theknor leaned forward with interest. Can you give us an example? Sarah looked around the cargo bay and spotted what she needed. Your lighting system, she said, pointing to the glowing panels overhead. It's beautiful and efficient. But what happens if the power goes out? Emergency power activates, Veltar answered. And if that fails? Secondary emergency power. And if that fails too? The engineer's leaves drooped. Then the lights go out. Sarah pulled a small flashlight from her pocket, a simple device with an LED bulb and batteries. She clicked it on, creating a bright beam of light. This is human backup lighting. No connection to ship's power. No dependency on complex systems. It works for hours on stored energy, and the energy source can be replaced by hand. The aliens stared at the flashlight like it was alien technology, which Sarah realized from their perspective it was, but it's so primitive, said one of the Vortaki. Your light source is crude compared to our plasma illumination. But my light source works when yours doesn't, Sarah pointed out. Sometimes primitive is better. Dr. Zarathek was taking rapid notes on her datapad. This philosophy explains many puzzling aspects of human technology. Your vehicles, for instance. They appear inefficient compared to our gravitic propulsion, but they function in environments where our systems would fail. That's right, Sarah said. A human car can drive through mud, over rocks in extreme temperatures. It might not be as fast or clean as your ships, but it'll get you where you need to go even when conditions are terrible. Terrible conditions, mused Admiral Theknor. We've designed our civilization to avoid such things. Perfect environmental control, ideal operating parameters, optimal efficiency. But what you're suggesting is that preparing for terrible conditions makes you stronger overall? Sarah nodded. It's like immune systems. If you never encounter disease, your body doesn't know how to fight it. If you never encounter problems, your technology doesn't know how to handle them. The conversation continued for hours, as the aliens began to understand the fundamental difference between their approach and humanity's. They had achieved incredible sophistication by controlling their environment so perfectly that they never had to deal with chaos. Humans had achieved incredible resilience by assuming chaos was normal and planning accordingly. As the day wore on, the questions became more practical. How did humans handle system failures? What did they do when materials broke down? How did they maintain complex structures without constant technological intervention? Sarah found herself drawing diagrams on old-fashioned paper, explaining concepts that the aliens had never needed to learn. Load distribution, failure modes, redundant systems, emergency protocols that didn't require computer coordination. This is remarkable, said Ambassador Kethvar, as Sarah finished explaining how suspension bridges could flex in earthquakes instead of breaking. Your entire species has been trained in what we would consider advanced engineering principles. Not trained, Sarah corrected. Forced to learn. Earth doesn't give you a choice. You learn to deal with gravity and structural stress and system failures, or you don't survive. The meeting reached its climax when Admiral Theknor asked the question that had been building all day. Dr. Chen, given what we've learned, what would you recommend for human integration into galactic civilization? Sarah had been thinking about this for 3 days ever since her pen shattered their perfect chamber. I think you've got it backwards, she said. Instead of humans learning to adapt to your systems, maybe your systems need to learn from humans. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Dr. Zarathek spoke up. You're suggesting that we modify our technology? I'm suggesting that you make it more robust. Add some redundancy. Build in some tolerance for failure. Sarah gestured to the cargo bay around them. This room survived the chamber collapse because it was built like human construction. Solid, simple, over-engineered. Maybe that's not primitive. Maybe that's smart. Admiral Theknor exchanged glances with his senior staff. What kind of modifications are you proposing? Start small, Sarah suggested. Add some manual backup systems to critical functions. Build some structures that don't require constant power. Design some ships that can handle rough conditions. She smiled. Let humans work alongside your engineers as equals. Not as students. Equals, repeated Kethvar. But this time the word didn't sound impossible. The meeting ended with something unprecedented in galactic history. A technologically superior civilization asking a primitive species for engineering advice. The rehabilitation program was quietly shelved. In its place, they established something new. A partnership. Over the following weeks, human engineers began arriving on galactic ships and stations. They brought with them toolboxes full of simple instruments, notebooks full of hand-drawn diagrams, and minds trained to solve problems without perfect conditions. The first joint project was redesigning the Harmonious Convergence's emergency systems. Instead of elegant computer-controlled evacuation procedures, they installed crude but effective escape routes. Instead of delicate energy field barriers, they added solid blast doors that would work even with power failures. Sarah stood in the ship's new emergency command center, watching human and alien engineers work side by side. The center itself was a compromise between their approaches, beautiful alien technology backed up by robust human redundancy. Dr. Chen called Veltar from across the room. The plant-like engineer had become one of